I feel very touched that you're interested in this subject, because for me, the title even, healing with compassion, connection, and joy, shows us that there's such a deep longing in our heart to get free of the burdens and the barriers that have prevented us from feeling fully alive, fully connected and caring for others, but also have been a barrier sometimes in our own spiritual path or personal evolution. So I often think about this wonderful quote by Rumi. He said, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to find and remove the barriers you have built against it." Lately, I've been contemplating much more on joy. I'm about to start a whole new part of my book on that subject. And I realized that quote works very well for joy too, doesn't it? Our task is not to seek for joy, but merely to find and remove the barriers we have built against it. So, I mean, right now in the pandemic, isn't it? Many of us are going through a lot of different types of difficulties on all different layers of our life, and plus the fact that it hasn't ended, right? So that's already a challenge. And we realize we have much less chance to experience the things that used to bring us a sense of happiness and joy. But even before the pandemic, we lived with habitual patterns that we really don't like. We judge in ourselves. We sometimes have a very strong inner critical voice who's always, throwing spears at us. Some of us suffer from low self-esteem or feeling that somehow we're not worthy of love. So all of this is part of the obstacles to our experiencing well-being and resilience and joy. So I just want to now start with the talk describing a little bit about resilience and some of the things that I found in my research on the connection between self-compassion, well-being, and resilience. Now, most of us think of resilience as flexibility, like the ability to adapt when there's a storm, for example, and some trees are able to move with the wind, and because of that, then they don't blow over, right? But a deeper meaning of resilience is that even in the midst of great difficulties, it's our human capacity to find value or meaning. And this really came through in Viktor Frankl's experience of living in the concentration camps. And he observed that when people had a purpose or reason to live, even when they were very frail, they survived the experience. Whereas people who were healthier and more robust, but with no purpose, didn't survive. But there's an even deeper understanding of resilience, which is that it's the ability to thrive and feel alive, even in the midst of life's storms. So that's what we're going for. That's a sign that we have reconnected with the source of love within us and with the source of joy. So Professor Richard Davidson is working at the University of Wisconsin and researching on the science of well-being, particularly looking at the connections between the mind, the brain, and the body. And he said, in our research, we're asking the question, why are some people vulnerable in the face of adversity and other people seem to be resilient? And what they learned is that our experience of stress and burnout are not solely dependent on the external circumstances. The research demonstrated that these start in our mind. And by using physiological measurements, they found that our mind is in constant communication with our brain and our body. And actually, our brain and our body are then responding to the messages from our mind. Do you hear that? Do you sense what that means? So if you notice the state of your mind, we might be a little bit worried, but our mind is actually producing physiological changes in our body and in our brain, directing whether our body goes in the direction of ill health, stress, depression, or anxiety, or whether our body goes in the direction of improved health, improved energy, sense of wellness and connection. So one of the things that Richard Davidson likes to point out is that we weren't born with a habit of developing well-being. And he asks this question, did you brush your teeth this morning? Were you born with this habit? No, you learned it, right? Similarly, he says, we can learn the habit of well-being. So we do need to make a decision to apply ourselves towards healing, towards coming in contact with compassion for ourselves, connection with others, and that sense of aliveness and joy. And he said, we sometimes think, well, I don't have time for that. But every morning, ask yourself, what's more important for my well-being, whether I brush my teeth or whether I look after my mind? So think about that. But still, just having an intellectual understanding of the problem isn't enough, because research has demonstrated that the real change we're seeking for comes from changing our feelings. So I want to describe to you some research done, reported by Dr. Fredrickson, Barbara Fredrickson, in her book, Love 2.0. And I got really excited reading this book. You know, have you ever had a book where you really were so excited by something in it, you would start to write down lines under certain sentences, right? Or you would kind of bend the top of the page so you know to come back to that page. Well, as I was reading this book, I got more and more excited about what it was saying, and I was starting to underline almost every sentence, and I was kind of bending the top of every page because all of it was so remarkable. I mean, we have heard for years people reporting subjectively that meditation or meditating on loving kindness would make them feel better or happier or more at ease. But these are just subjective reports. They don't really have much scientific significance. But what I found exciting in this book is that the researchers were using physiological measurements like brain scans, immune markers, checking hormone levels to see what's actually happening in a person's brain and body when they're contemplating on love. So the most well-known way of contemplating on love is the meditation known as loving kindness. And that's the meditation I guided for you earlier in this session. It's a variation of the loving kindness meditation. So during loving kindness, while we're thinking of somebody, we're silently repeating phrases as we did. May you be happy. May you be well. So interesting finding is called, the discovery that they had is called mirror neurons. So when they were researching the effect of loving kindness meditation, in the experiment, they had two strangers sitting across from each other in a room. And one of the two people was silently practicing the loving kindness meditation while the other one was sitting there probably a little bit bored, not knowing what was happening. But what they found is that the parts of the brain associated with happiness and well-being were lighting up in the person doing the meditation, but the exact same areas of the brain were lighting up in the person who the meditation was being directed towards. And they called this phenomena mirror neurons. So I'm going to describe soon more of the findings of these physiological measurements on people who were practicing loving kindness. But first I want to say a little bit more about how Fredrickson herself defines love. Because normally we think of love, isn't it, as a relationship between two people. But that means that if we have a partner or a parent or a child, someone meaningful in our life who's now gone, we might believe that we have no opportunity to experience love. But she found a very unique way of defining love. She calls it moments of positive resonance. So what she's describing is that on a verbal or nonverbal way, we make a connection with others, even people we don't know. Sometimes it's just through a sincere gaze, or doing something playful, or saying a genuine thank you to a cashier. Moments when we really connect with somebody, with a sense of care, kindness, or playfulness. That's it. That's her definition of love. So if you really think about that, there's actually many chances during the day, isn't there, to have these moments of love, of positive resonance with people you know, obviously, but with strangers, with small children, with animals. And the benefit of these moments are actually stored in our brain, in our nervous system, which gradually starts to build well-being, and that is what results in enhanced resilience. So now I want to tell you a story about one of my heroes called Donna. So Professor Fredrickson had lunch with her friend Donna while she was in the midst of this research. And she noticed even before they sat down that her friend looked really terrible. So when she asked Donna how she was doing, Donna described that she had such high levels of stress in her work at the moment. She's a woman who is single, who lives alone, and for some reason her boss just decided to make her the scapegoat of the company. Everything Donna did, they found fault with. Everything she was doing wrong. And yet in spite of that, they piled more and more work on top of her. She said her stress level was getting so high because she felt like she was failing in every direction. But the hardest thing for her was that her colleagues, some of whom were her good friends, were also turning against her and gossiping about her and blaming her for everything that went wrong, things that she wasn't even responsible for. She said her life was miserable. Her stress was at an all-time high. She was tense. She couldn't eat and couldn't sleep. And this was making her weaker and making it harder for her to perform at work. So things just were getting worse and worse. She was desperate. So you can imagine how Donna's ears perked up when she heard Professor Fredrickson describe the research that she'd been doing, demonstrating the physiological benefits of practicing love. First was that the level of oxytocin in the brain goes very high. Now, oxytocin is sometimes called the feel-good hormone. It's what your body produces when you first fall in love or when a woman first takes her newborn child in her arm. The second is that they found the changes in the genetic expression. So most of us know that we were born with a certain set of genes that we inherited from our parents. We don't have much control over that, right? But what actually makes our body go towards increased health and better immunity, or more often illness and risk of mortality, is in how our genes express, which is known as the telomeres. So people who have been focusing on love have a higher genetic expression, raising the body's level of health, immunity, which naturally then affects their longevity. But Fredrickson said the most startling effect was the change in the tone of the vagus nerve. Now, the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in our body, and the ventral vagus nerve is connecting to our brain, the brain stem, to our lungs, our heart, and all the other major organs of the body. And when it's in a good tone, we have a feeling of being loved and connected. We experience a sense of ease and well-being. Now, previously, scientists had never seen changes in the vagal tone over a person's whole lifetime. It seemed to be fixed. But when they did this experiment, people who agreed to learn and regularly practice this meditation on loving kindness for just 10 minutes a day, over 3 weeks, their vagal tone improved so dramatically the researchers thought that the machines taking the measurements were broken. And they said that by doing this meditation over just a few weeks, it had lasting positive changes in the brain and in the nervous system. Now, doesn't that give you hope? That's an encouragement for practicing well-being. Well, it gave Donna a lot of hope, but she wasn't interested to learn the loving kindness meditations, but she made a decision to collect 3 times a day moments of positive resonance. She figured, well, nothing else has helped, so why not? And Dr. Fredrickson said that a few weeks later, Donna had sent her a letter saying that doing this 3 times a day is making a huge difference in her life. But the most surprising result came 1 year later. So once again, Donna and Fredrickson had lunch together, and Fredrickson noticed how radiant and good Donna looked. So of course she assumed, well, she must have found a new job by now, right? So when they started to talk, Fredrickson was totally surprised when Donna said that her work situation was even worse than it had been the year before. But as a result of her collecting these moments of positive resonance, first with strangers, she started to develop more connection with her neighbors. And then she eventually reconnected to family members that she had been distant from. So over the years, she gained more resources in her life than she had ever had. And a year later, even though her work setting was much worse, in spite of that, she was thriving. Difficulties were rolling off her like water off a duck's back. So I want to connect this now to compassion and self-compassion. So very briefly, if I was to define compassion, it means that when we are aware of, when we see another person suffering, our heart is moved with a wish to relieve it. Now, self-compassion is when we're aware of our own suffering, our heart is moved with a desire to alleviate it. Much like we did in the meditation that we just started this session with, right? So what are the benefits of self-compassion? Well, you'll be hearing more about them over the weekend if you're taking the whole retreat. But first of all, I just want to say that contrary to what people think, self-compassion is not weakness, but a source of strength. Research has demonstrated that self-compassion is the most powerful coping mechanism for dealing with painful life challenges like illness, divorce, or grief. And when they looked at veterans from war, previously, it was thought that the main factor contributing to whether or not a combat veteran got post-traumatic stress disorder was the amount of combat that they actually experienced. But the scientists found that veterans who had seen even a lot of combat and who had compassion for themselves did not get post-traumatic stress disorder. So I want to just summarize some of the other benefits that researchers have found. Self-compassion enhances our sense of well-being, connection, and joy, creates lasting changes in our body's level of health. It heals past pain and dispels negative tendencies that we've been collecting all our lives. And a really valuable aspect of building well-being and kindness and compassion is that instead of being at the mercy of external events, we develop something called agency. Now, agency means that we decide to take responsibility for our own well-being and happiness instead of feeling at the mercy of other people or circumstances in our life, even if it's just deciding to do one thing in a more creative or healthy way. And agency has been found recently to be one of the biggest factors for helping people to overcome burnout, anxiety, and depression. And naturally, of course, the more we're in touch with our good heart, the more we develop a sense of understanding and care for ourselves. We develop clear communication in our relationships with others. And so all of this results in resilience, aliveness, and joy. So like Donna, we're able to flow with life's difficulties. I want to share with you a quote by a Buddhist nun named Pema Chodron. She wrote, "On the other hand, you could just relax and realize that behind all the worry, complaint, and disapproval that goes on in your mind. The sun is always coming up in the morning, moving across the sky, and going down in the evening. Birds are always out there collecting their food, making their nests, flying across the sky. The grass is always being blown by the wind or standing still. Food and flowers and trees are all growing out of the earth. There's enormous richness. You could develop your passion for life and your curiosity and your interest. You could connect with your joyfulness. You could start right now.